Welcome to Gardenside Chats, where we bring together the voices of the natural landscaping movement to share the beauty and benefits of native plant gardening. Wild Ones promotes native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. We encourage everyone to join us.
Hello, my name is Lisa Olsen, and I'm a chapter liaison with Wild Ones. In that role, I support the founding, growth, and mission fulfillment of chapters all across the country. Wild Ones promotes native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. We're a member-supported, volunteer-driven nonprofit working to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet. Today, I am chatting with landscape architect, artist, and educator Preston Montague, who produced Wild One's Greensboro, North Carolina native garden design for the Piedmont region. We asked Preston to share his thoughts about how to change public perception about native plants, how natural landscapes support community resilience, and what we can learn from nature to achieve our vision of native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community. Welcome, Preston.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. I am flattered to be here. It has been so rewarding to participate with Wild Ones, to support Wild Ones, and I'm so excited about the work you're doing. And especially an organization that has such a long legacy. I don't know if I bump into a lot of members that realize that Wild Ones has been in operation for 40 years almost.
Yep,
It's astonishing
we've
and
been at it for a
wonderful.
while. And I will share that Wild Ones members are what we call agents of change, and they utilize storytelling to forge an emotional connection and prompt people to act. And we encourage our members and volunteers to share their personal experience with Wild Ones with others, and to share how they got involved, and in particular, why they got involved. What has motivated them to take action, and what solidified their personal commitment to Wild One's mission. So to start, I will ask you, Preston, to share your personal journey, how you came to be an advocate for native plants and natural landscaping, and was there any sort of epiphany or an aha moment or moments where you came to know with certainty that the native plants, reintroducing, I should say, native plants into disturbed and degraded spaces has the power to really bring life back into those spaces?
Hmm. Oh, thank you for that question, Lisa. Gosh, I didn't get into gardening through an ecological perspective. I arrived in 2006 after discovering gardening while working as an artist, an installation artist. And I was also at the time working in the aquarium trade, largely in planted aquariums, which was a fabulous job. And gosh, I reminisce about it a lot. But I was having a lot more fun working as an installation artist. And so I was creating all sorts of outdoor sculptures as wild and weird as, putting like a ladder that's like 20 foot tall into the ground with a star at the top for for a wealthy patron that wanted to be reminded every time he left the house that about his past as becoming successful. I know that's kind of a weird thing to describe. I'm stumbling over my words already, but I was working on doing some really kind of high concept outdoor art, and increasingly I was having to work in the landscape around these installations, and patrons were asking me more and more to create things that were kind of like a garden. I was having to bring in hardscape materials or bring in plants. And at the time I was loosely gardening at home, but mostly in koi ponds and in aquariums that I had around the house. And so I discovered gardening. And also I was living in a downtown setting and had people really kind of plucking vegetables and herbs out of my garden. I remember having people actually sleeping in my garden shed at the time that I didn't realize. And I was like, golly, my garden is positively impacting social and environmental justice. This is so much more important than the installation artwork that I was creating. I thought I had opportunity now to have a job that really impacted the people and the planet. And so I returned to school for horticulture and later landscape architecture, but it was a very conventional approach to gardening that I was taking. The interest I had in plants was largely tropical, very exotic, lots of water lilies and lotus. I remember at first were the plants that really got me captivated in horticulture. Um, but after I graduated from with a master's in landscape architecture, I coincidentally discovered the native plant movement, I guess you could say, through the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference. And this was just something that I began casually attending because I had friends from horticulture school going, and I just wanted to um, play in the woods for a week in a beautiful rainforest setting. But over time, as I began to go to that conference repeatedly, I began to really understand how important this work is and how small gestures in the landscape can have big impacts on local ecology, and how so much of that important work seemed centered around landscapes that focused on native plants. And so, about this time, I began working in landscape architecture, and a lot of my entry level duties were designing parking lots, designing very commercial spaces, places that you zip by at 45 miles an hour, but I think actually make a huge impact in how we think the landscape should be ordered. And so, at the time, I became quickly bored with creating landscapes that were code compliant. Municipalities treat commercial and municipal landscapes by separating them out into what are called planting yards by many municipalities. And these are like streetscapes, perimeter buffers, parking lot plantings, these very conventional landscapes that we access every day. I was getting bored with just choosing the same rhythm of plants to knock it out. I've just never really been interested in knocking out landscape design. For me, it is, and maybe to my detriment, it is a personal and emotional journey. It's why I'm so selective about clients that I take on, because I can't separate myself from the work. And what I discovered early on in those very early design experiences in firms was that well, first of all, I was creating parking lots for a fast food chain across the Southeast, and decided I wasn't interested in making the parking lots of these fast food chains the same in Charleston, South Carolina as Roanoke, Virginia. I just knew intuitively that even commonly available plants are, like Burford hollies and crepe myrtles and these other things that I was, planting without concern. It just didn't feel like the right thing to put the same plants in Charleston as Roanoke. And so this forced me to begin to think critically about not only plant survivability in these areas as an effort towards sustainability, because my education in landscape design and horticulture was actually in permaculture. And so it was a very radical education, which I'm so thankful for. It really helped push the boundaries. But ultimately, I not only was trying to make plant selections for these different locations, focusing on plants that I knew would survive the environment around Charleston and survive the environment around Roanoke, and how that forced me to make different plant decisions. But also, I appreciated how these species were providing a sense of place to these locations. And I would, really begin to lean on my installation art background to use sable palms and other very familiar kind of like rah-rah South Carolina plants in these parking lots, not only to define a sense of place in these really mundane places, but also to make selections for plants, of course, that would be more resilient in that climate. And so that really imbued my work with, I think, one of its first missions. I mean, my training is in sustainability and permaculture, at least from a horticulture perspective. And it finally, I finally had a mission to that early entry-level landscape architecture work that really gave me the interest I needed to keep going.
Well, I, for one, appreciate you and others who take the effort, make the effort to transform those public spaces. I have been known to surreptitiously collect seeds in parking lot plantings
Right.
across the country. And so, yeah, I really value when people do put the thought into, what more could this space be? And appreciate that you've been doing that in your work and your practice throughout your career. In addition to being a landscape architect, you are also an educator. And in your experience with your students and with your clients, what do you see as the biggest educational challenges, the gaps that need to be filled for people to make the connection between native plants and healthy communities, healthy living?
Well, I think maintenance is where I am focusing my education, not only for myself, but for my clients as well. But taking a step back, building a priority for ecological landscape design, for focusing on native plants where possible. In my designs and with my students' designs, that's a big priority for me. And helping my students create that first mission, I think is very, very helpful. And it gives them, I think, a little bit more gas in the tank as they make design decisions. Also, it really helps them narrow down some of those initial conceptual design decisions as they say, okay, I'm going to step into this space, which I suppose could be anything. But if I begin to look at this through the lens of ecological landscape design, suddenly I begin thinking about a conservationist first and seeing, okay, what patches, what corridors might already be present on this property? And suddenly, boom, you've got some initial design decisions made. And from that, you can build off, well, how can I connect habitat throughout the project to these intact or stabilized patches and corridors? And so it begins to help a designer create that chain of decisions, and that can be very, very important for a lot of young designers. And I say young designers because I mentioned to my students that landscape architecture sometimes I think favors the young in that you have to see and experience landscapes. I think it's important to garden. And so experience, I think landscape architecture, um, to me, it just gets better with age. And so for my young students who are 18, 19, 20, this is assuming, my university teaching obligations, they just really haven't seen much of the world yet and really haven't begun to see the nature around them yet. And so I just don't know really where they draw their design decisions from. And so at least getting in there and demonstrating how to begin making design decisions from an ecological landscape design framework, it gives them something to work off of. It's that piece of dust that the snowflake builds off of.
Well, obviously, you're coaching your students in their work to persuade potential clients about incorporating native plants into designs. And are there any talking points that you lean on in your work with your clients? Any circumstances or what factors that you've observed as being the primary motivators, the drivers that people are responding to when prompted to transform landscapes into habitat?
Oh gosh, well, I think that there is still a lot of education to be made with how to unpack what habitat means. And it's a word that I find difficult to use in a range of settings only because it's people a lot of people seem primed to make the connection between habitat and undesirable wildlife. But I think habitat is one of the most important things that we are creating relative to ecological landscape design. I mean, North Carolina recently passed a bill that any state funds used towards the landscape, whether that's landscapes installed by the Department of Transportation, whether that's like a landscape around a new state park, it's mandatory that it be native. And thinking through exactly what it is that we are trying to create, knowing that, I mean, I know that I can plant with native plants and not get anything done. I can certainly put native plants in the wrong place. I can select species that don't necessarily demonstrate a lot of ecosystem service potential. I can use species that are arranged in a way that are so strange to wildlife that they don't necessarily use it because it's odd. Right. And so I think we are just beginning to recognize that we are gardening, but building habitat. And that actually may have some rules that we need to pay attention to, and rules that may impact the way our native plantings look and are perceived. If we are planting according to, let's say conventional landscapes that we learn from commercial settings, we are just kind of dotting plants in a giant mulch bed, according to, I think, at best, some traditional aesthetic layering techniques that maybe we learned from cottage gardening from, I don't know, 18th century England. And that may be comforting to us. It may be even aesthetically pleasing to us. But is it organized in a way that signals to wildlife that this is a resource-rich environment? I think that really is a new frontier for us. And for those of you with your eyes wide open who see the landscape and are pushing boundaries by designing and layering plants according to how plants layer and organize in your area, you may be ahead of the game. And so this is one of the reasons why and I'm off topic here. I'm just riffing, Lisa. Thank you for the space. I think what I'm trying to do now in my education work about using native plants is we understand now that certain native species outperform others relative to ecological service, rather relative to the benefits that they provide to wildlife. And this is a big aha moment for me and the rest of us, I think, relative to keystone species, recognizing that if you have a limited amount of space and a limited budget, that focusing on those species that provide superlative benefits to wildlife is at least a place to start with that daunting task of what plants, right? And it's like, okay, well, once you figure out the right plants for the environment that you're planting in, like behind me, this is my front yard. And though you see pretty common plants you'd associate with a wetland, this garden is insanely dry and hot and sun and wind blasted. And it's only through really pruning techniques that these plants flower and stay so healthy. But I don't want to get too off topic. Once you understand right plant, and then there's that old adage, right plant, right place. And so this is the thing that I'm focusing on my practice and understanding and in teaching students, that I think we have a good handle on native species. Now it's time to explore native structure and native change. And so the way that I would organize plants and the way that I would recommend their maintenance would be different in Raleigh, North Carolina to Flagstaff or Anchorage, because wildlife has adapted not only to the species that are in those places, but also, I think, responding to the way those plants organize themselves. We're beginning to discover that one of the challenges with cultivars of native plants is it doesn't take very much tweaking before we begin to signal to insects that a formerly resource heavy plant maybe is sick or unhealthy. And these may be qualities that we don't see, because if you look at blooms of native plants in infrared light, suddenly new colors and patterns emerge. But I don't think that we are breeding plants for qualities like that. I think that we're breeding them to become more compact, more floriferous, double flowering, these sorts of, I think, largely ornamental, um, anthropocentric concerns. And so, I'm concerned that the way that you arrange plants may signal to wildlife that this is a healthy or an unhealthy setting. And furthermore, the way that we organize plants may, I think that animals and insects, they have these comfortable patterns, and birds may land in trees in a sequence. And if you remove understory trees from a setting and only have canopy trees, perhaps you are signaling something to that species of bird that something's not right. And so they just kind of have an impulse decision, as wildlife has. We have the luxury and the comfort to make all sorts of, unhealthy decisions for ourselves. But I have faith that wildlife have to make quick snap decisions because they could get snatched out of the air by a hawk, let's say a songbird, for example. And so perhaps they're flying over a yard that has been meticulously designed for songbirds, but leaving out a certain part of the layering, like saying not having understory trees. You may have species of birds that you want to bring into the yard actually not arrive because they don't have a safe place to land. And so this is a wide world that I'm just beginning to understand, and I don't, have conclusions. But basically, what I'm trying to do is just walk around in spaces that are disturbed as little as possible. So I hopefully get as much truth in how plants organize themselves around me, and then take those organizational strategies into the garden so that I'm not arranging plants in an arbitrary way. I don't want to just operate on hope. I want to have, I want to make research driven decisions. And the same goes for change. I mean, I'm basically just simulating like ruminant forage. I suppose with all of my management techniques that I teach people, particularly for herbaceous focused plantings like the one behind me, we're just using string trimmers and lawnmowers. And so we're just simulating, the buffalo, the elk, the deer, the rabbit, these things. And gosh, if I could also introduce fire, I think that would represent native change. We're experiencing tremendous devastation here in Western North Carolina right now. But, I suppose, and I know it's too soon, but if we're talking about some sort of very thin silver lining, once we begin to stabilize that region, with all of that disturbance will turn into flowers. It'll turn into change. Um, and, I'm trying to understand, well, how can I be the hurricane? How can I also, be the lightning and set the fires? And if that sort of change is too big or illegal, because I can't set fires in, say, settings like, behind me, downtown Durham, I guess I'm always the browser. And so how does that impact the plant decisions that I make? If all I'm able to do relative to native change is just simulate deer?
Well, these are radical concepts indeed, and I agree, absolutely areas that we need to explore simply because many of the spaces that we are working to transform have been highly disrupted and degraded, and those natural processes are no longer part of the ecological cycle. So I'm excited to hear more about how we can simulate and reintroduce some of those processes. I will pivot a little bit to talk about the fact that the native plant movement is indeed still tied to horticulture, and it's evolution. I will say it's gardens that we visited years ago as kids are not the same as they are now, and things have transformed over time. And I will say that over the past several years, we have seen a substantial shift in the conversation around natural landscaping. And at a talk now years ago, I alluded to the shift and I said that landscaping with native plants is no longer the fringe, but the future of landscaping. And the natural landscaping movement is venturing into the mainstream. We have mainstream media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post featuring stories about incorporating native plants into managed landscapes. And an article about Wild Ones Native Garden Designs program appeared in the New York Times real estate section of the print edition of the Sunday paper. And that directly links, in my mind, Wild Ones' mission to broader economic concerns. I know here on the Front Range, if you ask people, and in many Western states, if you ask people, why are you planting native plants? It's not necessarily to benefit wildlife, it's to save money on their water bill. I mean, water is expensive and it's not readily available. And so the motivator there is a financial driver. Here on the Western slopes, the conversation here is sometimes different than what we typically engage in Wild Ones. But I will also say that I've been gratified to see the trends that are reported by the Garden Media Group. They are a public relations and marketing communications firm that report year-over-year trends in gardening. And they have, over the past 2 decades, reported a renewed interest in native plants and a focus on nature's impact on mental wellness, and a mounting wave of eco-optimism stemming from the green industry's potential to alleviate eco-anxiety that is pervasive among among people young and old who are striving to contribute positively to the climate. And so as an green economy stakeholder and an active participant in the horticulture industry, how do you view the change in public perception, and how do you think we can ground the acceptance and expand, I should say, the acceptance of natural landscaping, both locally and across the country?
Wow, yes. I mean, I saw a rapid uptick in the interest in ecological landscape design, in native plants, following the pandemic. And certainly at native plant conferences that I attend, we've seen an explosion in interest and attendance. And yes, I think people are frustrated with the news that they hear about the state of the environment and the natural feelings that that creates. I think we're just accumulating stress and guilt, frustration and anger about a problem we don't understand necessarily how to fix. And I mean, all those emotions just get bottled up, I think. And gardening, as I think it, which is healthcare, not only for the planet, but for ourselves, I see it's a very natural expression to get some of that frustration out, to get some of that anger out, to get some of the guilt and the need to do good. I think it gives people a mission. I think it really activates people. I think it reinvigorates interest in perhaps gardeners that had perhaps just become a little bit bored with, I suppose, gardening for gardening's sake. And I absolutely love that my design practice is primarily people who have heard the call and want to create this for themselves and have me set a stage for them to not only create habitat, but to garden themselves. And this just feels like, well, Yeah, I think this mission gives people a lot of motivation, and the fact that we can make small changes in the small spaces that we control is so exciting to me. It doesn't feel like a waste of time to plant a few native trees, or to do some small scale gardening, because you are making an impact on wildlife in ways you may not understand, that may require a wildlife camera, or a lot of time spent in the garden for you to see. But you may be providing nourishment and resources for one of the last few butterflies of a species that still come to your area, because historically there have been patches of this plant or that, and you have given, or reinserted one more specimen of that milkweed or that oak that has historically been part of a larger plant population that has supported a larger, say, insect or songbird population. And so these little way stations we're creating, I think, matter. And furthermore, I think that gardeners beget gardeners, that friends see friends having a lot of fun in the garden, having some mission in their lives, making some traction on this thing that otherwise just seems to accumulate frustration and irritation over the course of the day. This kind of like this eco guilt, eco frustration. I think people see people getting some relief from that, even in just planting and gardening and weeding. And I see that, yeah, gardeners beget gardeners, and it can be really addictive. And people tend to, one neighbor, for example, this garden behind me, I have neighbors reach out to me about just making what I've made in my yard in their yard. And so slowly this neighborhood is beginning to accumulate these really wild patches, focusing on native plants. But I mean, there's some other southern pass-along plants from far-flung locales. The planting behind me isn't purely native. I get gifted a lot of plants as a horticulturist and include them as well. But you know, um, as my design practice, I try and encourage people to try and have 60% of the plant list be native plants, and that 60% by volume of the garden be native plants, and make sure that keystone species, whether tree, shrub, or herbaceous plant, that we focus on including them first, and then begin to play with far-flung material from across the world, or that great crinum that your grandmother had at her house. Those southern pass-alongs. And frankly, this garden behind me was a dead zone. When I started gardening, it was literally gravel from front to back. The previous homeowner did not want to do any gardening, did not want to have any chaos, didn't want any birds or insects, and they did not have any. And we just sprinkled a little bit of soil on top of that gravel and planted right into it. I mean, there's really not very much infrastructure in this. And I learned a big lesson early on, in that I stuffed this full of native species and I had a lot of failure. And a lot of that was because I was selecting native species that were not appropriate for this sun-blasted, wind-blasted, gravelly area. But I had Mediterranean herbs that come from environments like that were thriving. And the microclimate that those early pioneer herbs and South African species that I had planted, like in the microclimates around those plants, or where I'm beginning to have more success with native sedges and other native plants that were available to me at the time, almost exclusively from a wetland nursery. So I didn't really have a lot of native plants at my disposal at that time. But in the slight afternoon shade of that rosemary, suddenly I had the ability to grow Monarda and a few sedges. And it just spread out from there, as those sedges and that Monarda created favorable conditions for other species, as shade patterns were created, as soil was developed, and it became spongier and better able to hold on to moisture. And it wasn't long before suddenly I became the only house on the block with fireflies. And I don't necessarily think that developed exclusively because of the native plants that I brought into the garden. I think it was just because I added plants and planted densely and created suitable microclimates to at least provide enough resources for those fireflies. But and I get some other kind of signals like when monarchs visit my landscape, they only seem to go to the Mexican zinnias and but largely I'm finding that it is the native plants in my garden that seem to be covered in the most insects and which seem to provide the most insect forage across the year. And so I don't really have a great way to document what insects, what birds, and what mammals are visiting my yard. That's just kind of like it's on the to-do list, a very deep to-do list with understanding this work. Because again, I'm very nervous about doing this arbitrarily. And the more that we understand about native plant environments, the more we understand that we can't be arbitrary, that there's rules to this game we just don't understand. And as we try and maximize the ecosystem service potential of these landscapes, I think we're discovering, precisely as I mentioned, that the way that you organize these plants matter, the way you manage these landscapes also matter. Because you could accidentally mow or string trim plants down at a time when animals are coming through, the flow of wildlife is coming through that perhaps needed those plants at that time. For example, being too tidy in the garden and removing dead stems of plants and cleaning up the leaves on the ground too much. We're discovering that, oh gosh, we can like really negatively impact the capacity of our gardens to provide for wildlife, even by just the way we maintain the garden and when we choose to clean up, etc. So it's like somehow simultaneously very difficult, delicate work to make a high ecosystem service potential native plant landscape, but also it's just incredibly easy, I find, to begin to develop populations of insects and songbirds around a garden when you're just beginning. And I think it's actually really it's unfair not to keep it up because animals and insects create lives and create populations that you may not be privy to in the trees around you and in the soil at the base of these plants. And to begin this path but then neglect it. I mean, you really are setting these animals and insects up for failure. So I encourage people to, as you get into this, really be careful for that second step in native plant gardening, where you've had those early victories and you want to take a deeper dive and continue to expand. But then, I find that you can clients get frustrated with, year two of maintenance. It's like, oh my gosh, well, all those early ruderal plants that flowered the first year didn't really set seed or come back the second year. The second year feels grassier and the first year seemed flowerier. And I try and help people through that second and third year to help them select for plants they do want and put pressure on plants they don't want so that they not only achieve their aesthetic aspirations, but they also learn how to preserve the resources they're creating and to just kind of hang on. Because a lot of these herbaceous plantings, like the one behind me, I think it takes 3 years for some of those populations to stabilize and for it to depending on your planting style, not feel so daunting. It also, it takes 3 years to maybe get a handle on some of any persistent weed problems. It may take 3 years for some of the plants in the seed mix you laid down to actually germinate and emerge. So, really, I think that this favors the patient, and the advantage of having wild ones is that you have support because it's so much easier to give up and just mow it back into lawn if you don't feel like you've got support and allies, if not around you, then at least online. And Wild Ones, I think, provides that. If not the in-person experience, at least being an online family.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, I will concur that gardens are not static. They are themselves an evolutionary
Mm.
process. And I know prior work at our nursery, people would come in and just be like, well, I just want to plant the plants and be done. And you're like, oh, okay, you just don't understand what gardening's all about because you're never done. It is a space where where there is constant flux and changes in the seasons and in, yes, the plant populations. They come, they go, and some years there's good seeds, and some years it was too dry in the spring and the plants didn't put enough effort into seed production because they knew there weren't the resources to sustain the next generation. It's a whole world of learning. And I agree, Wild Ones chapters are a space for folks who are new to gardening, new to native plants, to come and learn from their fellows on this journey of native landscapings. I will add that native plants, native plantings can transform spaces into focal points. I'm sure people driving by in your neighborhood notice your yard. You can always tell a native garden. Like if you're going on a tour and you're like, oh, well, let me find the address and look it up. And you're driving along going, oh, which house is it going to be? Oh, wait, I know which house it is. I mean, they just stand out. And these are spaces that connect people. You were talking about all the insect and bird populations that the gardens support, but they also have the power to address, to connect people, and through that address the environmental challenges that are local to that neighborhood, to that space. And it also forges, these gardens are spaces in which to forge social bonds, people learning from their peers. And this aligns with very, very strongly with why so many people are drawn to Wild Ones. It's we are about cultivating a community dedicated to making meaningful change. And if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on how gardens can forge and foster a shared sense of purpose among communities.
Yeah, well, gosh. If I ask people to, and this is part of a presentation I give, I ask people to close their eyes and imagine a native plant. And then I ask them to raise their hand if they imagined a tree. And then ask them to raise their hand if they imagined a shrub. And then ask them to raise their hand if they imagined a flowering herbaceous plant. And I'm finding that pretty overwhelmingly, what people imagine is an herbaceous flowering plant. And I'll bet 9 times out of 10, it's echinacea. But as people walk around and are looking for native plant gardens and what distinguishes a native plant garden, well, I'll bet a lot of people have native plant gardens and don't realize it because they may have a forested property with lots of native trees, or I think it's much less likely they have a lot of native shrubs. At least in North Carolina, we don't have a lot of shrubs, at least in the Piedmont of North Carolina, native to here. So we have to kind of look at the mountains or look at the coast and bring shrubs into our landscapes. I think it's the herbaceous plants like the landscape behind me that I think people think of as a native plant garden. It doesn't have to, if it's herbaceous, like the planting behind me, it could be full of exotic species. But I think that actually, perhaps we understand that the landscapes, at least here in the Piedmont, weren't always exclusively forested. In fact, I think that we, at least my ancestors, moved to a continent that was largely grassland. And I think that perhaps we even have I think we have this, and I can only speak from like I guess a Western European perspective here, but so much of the children's books that I had as a child seemed to have fairy tales that were either in the forest but also in cottage gardens, and I think that we are predisposed to see, I guess, cottage gardens like what I have behind me as a place that is resource rich for insects and birds, but maybe it's because it's in our face and we can see them and we just don't see all of the benefits that an oak tree might bring because all of the wildlife action is happening in the air. So I think that there is just something about an herbaceous planting like the one behind me that is maybe universally beloved, and it's full of texture and it's full of color, it's full of action, and I think that has a way of really drawing people in. It's like pop art. And but the challenge is, at least in the climate that I operate in here in in central North Carolina, we have 3 summers. And so herbaceous plantings like this grow quickly and problems escalate quickly. And so that's what I try. I mentioned getting ahead of people with that second and third year frustration. It's like, oh, give it a chance. Some of these problems cook themselves out of the equation. Um, and I'm getting a little off topic here, but I suppose it's these herbaceous plantings that really seem to, I think, strike an emotional chord in gardeners and non-gardeners. It wasn't until my front garden began to look like it does now in this photo before I saw people taking selfies in front of it. And even then, I don't think people started doing it until I started including pink and purple flowers in it. So I think there's some psychology in there as well I'm trying to understand. But ultimately, my front yard is a gift to the neighborhood. And it is a place for people to peck a strawberry. It's a place for people to kind of pause and be surprised that an urban garden can do this. It's a chance to pause and see butterflies kind of flitting about because a lot of the landscapes around me are just lawn. And so I think that the social opportunity here is to demonstrate love, care, compassion, and excitement using the garden. It's art, it's art, it's pop art to me. And I have no issues calling what I do an environmental art. I don't think that at all takes away from its incredibly important mission of slice by slice providing resources for animals and insects that may desperately need my little garden as a way station as they fly around the concrete and asphalt dominated downtown that I live in. And I think this is very challenging for a lot of Wild Ones members. And I bet people join this organization because they may have some frustration with the limitations of their HOA regulations or limitations with plant and information availability in their area. They may be frustrated with the environmental conditions they're trying to make these gardens into. This garden behind me wouldn't work if there was even an hour of shade kind of thing. This is a full sun blasted, gravelly garden, and it looks beautifully quickly because of those conditions. But if you're operating in like half a day of shade or with compacted soil where the topsoil is long since washed away or never was there in the beginning because of construction, these are frustrating circumstances for people trying to achieve what's behind me here. And so I also like to help a lot of clients understand, oh, your native planting isn't herbaceous. Too many trees. Soil's not correct. It's too, the right planting for you might be trees and shrubs. But kind of back to the social opportunities with gardens like this. I think one of the big places that I'm trying to put my energy now is to helping people understand how to organize these plants in a way that can survive the scrutiny of very conservative HOA regulations, that can survive the scrutiny of people who otherwise want lawn from one corner of the neighborhood to the next, people who, for whatever reason, have a low capacity to tolerate what they perceive as chaos. And so, how do you create native plant gardens and structure them and then maintain them in a way that survives even the harshest of scrutiny? That's right now my current mission. That's where Wild Ones really plugs in for me. And that's one of the reasons why I submitted that Greensboro design to show people how I take a kind of like a wild restoration approach to potentially a conservative environment relative to what's an acceptable form for landscaping. And I'm still figuring it out for myself. I think that the Greensboro design that I submitted might be kind of hairy for a very small landscape or a very intolerant environment. I think that I would remove the seed from the equation and just encourage people to plant with plugs and in an orderly, let's say, deli case fashion where it's, short in the front, tall in the back, and kind of gently sloped from front to back evenly. These sorts of things, they may disobey precedents of native structure, but a native structure may not be appropriate for where you live. Just having native plants arranged in a conventional fashion may be the limit of what your neighborhood may tolerate. And you know what? If those are native plants, particularly keystone species, you're at least providing that resource, even if you live in an environment where you couldn't add a seed layer under those plants that might cause it to be a little bit more unexpected, lots more surprises, maybe a little hairier, I should say. But there's so many different takes on native planting if you cruise through the various submitted landscapes. I mean, astonished, and I learned so much as a designer. So I've got, certain submissions that I use in very conventional or conservative environments with strict HOAs. And then I've got some more like mine, where if I've got some more space to flex or maybe a more relaxed attitude amongst neighbors, I'll follow my own advice in there. So there is a wide range of approaches to this. I have to say, for among Wild Ones members, on the spectrum of wild chaos to super highly organized, I'm somewhere, let's say, center left. I like it to be a little more unpredictable, a little bit wilder. I like to use seed mixes in addition to containerized plants because I'm finding that I enjoy the way throwing down a seed mix, plants select for microclimates that I may not have been aware of. Seed mixes reveal wet areas, shaded areas, high wind areas that unless I'm living in a tent on that property, wouldn't otherwise experience. And that really is another reason why I use seed mixes, because of just the limited capacity I have as a designer to really understand that space. Even with the techniques that I deploy for understanding the microclimates, I get surprised a lot. And I'm just not willing to only plant generalists to escape not really understanding microclimates. So, I plant a lot of species that I regard as generalists and keystone species because I know, for example, some sedges that I use, I know can be kind of fussy with their soil requirements. And I've got some sedges that will just go anywhere I put them, full sun, full shade, wet, dry, whatever. But I just don't get the diversity in my plantings if I just focus on those generalists. I do like to use seed mixes to get some surprises from some species that are either not available in containers or reveal to me that, oh, that spot gets hit by the irrigation and stays wetter than I realized because I only visited a total of 4 hours to the site. Um, but yeah, Lisa, I got way off track there. I appreciate this wandery conversation today. But I did just want to mention that I'm really impressed with just the range of information and takes on this work from Wild Ones. I also wanted to recognize that I just lucked out to be selected as someone to speak with the New York Times and for even this presentation. I'm just lucky. And I don't want to be the lead here. I want to recognize that there are so many more brilliant minds and other Wild Ones members that are operating a lot longer than I have their work on the website. And so I just want to basically pay my respect to all that work that's on there and just say I just lucked out by, being invited. Yeah.
Well, we are grateful for all that you've contributed and certainly grateful for the support that you offer the North Carolina chapters. I want to take a moment to pivot a little to the distress that North Carolina, Western North Carolina in particular, but really 6 states have been impacted by Hurricane Helene, and speak to a little bit to community resilience and how that is front of mind in the face of natural disasters that have been exacerbated by the increasingly volatile climate. And I think you have some thoughts around the role that native plants and natural landscapes maybe can play in post-disaster recovery and future resilience. And if you can identify some of the opportunities, some of the actions that Wild Ones members can take to mitigate risk and build resilience in their communities?
Yes, I had a difficult conversation with my students at North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro yesterday, where we decided to break from our the class rhythm that we had on our syllabus and just talk about how can you design for resilience in the landscape in the face of hurricanes? How can we as landscape architects focusing on, let's say, site design, say versus community and big scale planning, which landscape architects also participate in. But for those of us working in site design, making those planting, stormwater, soil decisions, how can we help to either reduce the impact of this if it happens again, and it will? What can we do to not help make the problem worse? And I think by the end of class, we all felt like, gosh, we realized that so much of the big scale changes in the way we build our environment that can contribute to flooding really happens in the city planning level of this work. The way we vote impacts the decisions that contribute to where people end up living and what sort of resources go to environmental protection. And, also there are just like historic precedents that we're dealing with here with, I suppose, people living in areas that are prone to flooding through economic disadvantage or whether, just for historic reasons. I mean, I think a lot of the towns in Western North Carolina that sustained the most damage, these are places along rivers and in places where they grew up because they were transporting goods from one place to the next. So I guess my students and I felt like we wish there were more that we could do in site design, but these are the things that we came up with that we want to include in all of our projects. One, we want to focus on intermittent stormwater management so that water arriving on our property leaves slower and cleaner than how it arrived. And so my students, we talked about not only the capacity of rain gardens, bioretention cells, bioswales, and even just places where depressions where water can at least sit for a second. These not only help reduce the velocity of stormwater, which can have tremendous erosion potential, but we also recognized that if you slow the velocity of stormwater down, a lot of the sediment that it may be carrying falls out of solution and lands back into your landscape. I mean, sediment pollution is the number one source of pollution here in my area for stream health. And so all these new, we're developing rapidly here in the center of North Carolina in general. And so, what I'm seeing is a lot of red streams because our current erosion control standards, particularly on big mega projects, I don't often see is adequate to make clean water exit a new construction site. I also see that in residential work, erosion control can be pretty spotty, sometimes totally absent because there's just not a lot of regulation attention on projects in the residential sector currently. We're just growing too rapidly. You just don't have enough people working for the city. Creating pockets, depressions, rain gardens, swales to move stormwater, just ways to interrupt that stormwater to reduce its velocity. And I encourage students to recognize that you can't just make a depression, that needs to be vegetated or else it's just going to be a mud pit? I mean, even if it's lawn, it may still provide some function, but why can't we begin to add, even at a conceptual or master plan level, grassland areas, particularly at the bottoms of hills or on the edges of forests, to not only so that they provide a bit of a mechanical filter for storm water as it cruises through our landscapes. And what I encourage students to recognize is that stormwater moving across a lawn may be evenly distributed, and so that velocity is evenly distributed. But once it hits the forest, it begins to reorganize into fast running little streamlets because it begins to find gaps between tree roots and it can become incredibly erosive in the woods. And I find that if water can roll through a lawn area, intercept a planting bed where that water is some soaked up and some of it is redistributed into a forest beyond at a slower rate, it doesn't necessarily have as much of an opportunity to recollect into damaging streamlets as it wiggles its way through the woods. Um, so we all realize, like, oh my gosh, even recommending just kind of grassland areas, big herbaceous plantings, is a radical recommendation. Um, I'm finding that our most of the landscapes that I encounter that are commercial, municipal, or institutional have have four components: hardscape, lawn, trees, maybe shrubs. But herbaceous plantings like that behind me are typically absent. In fact, I have a presentation series called Under the Radar for precisely that. Why are herbaceous planting regulations and recommendations absent from almost all municipal codes in North Carolina? Why is it either lawn or a weed? And what sort of impact does that have on the way we visualize and accept herbaceous plantings like that behind me? And so we recognized that insight design that frustrating the flow of stormwater can help with erosion problems and to also its irrigation, because as it intercepts planting beds and is absorbed into presumably a top soil layer and a mulch layer, that it holds on to that water, and that's irrigation. Irrigation isn't just about adding water. Irrigation is also about preventing losing water. And so dense, aggressively planted plantings like my Greensboro plan recommends, using seed to make sure that no gap remains after a year. These sorts of high density plantings behave as a green mulch and prevent stormwater loss through evaporation in the soil. And so your first line of irrigation isn't, again, to add water, it's to stop water from leaving the system. And so my students and I talked about how we're all going to be mostly arriving to sites that are completely devastated through the construction process because most of us will be working in new construction. And so we'll be walking onto sites where the topsoil has either been scraped off and sold or has just been so profoundly like mushed into the subsoil that's been brought up during construction that's functionally useless. And that the more that we can bring organic material to the site through the introduction of sometimes even just a thin topsoil layer, just to recreate the existing conditions. At least here in North Carolina, just reintroducing a couple of inches of organic material matches the natural precedent. Now, if this is New York or Wisconsin, that soil volume and composition changes, of course. But here in North Carolina, I encourage my students to specify at least 2 inches of organic material to return to the site, and certainly for planting beds. Maybe not lawn. I would rather spend the money getting that organic material into herbaceous planting beds and into the root pits of trees, and not just save some of that for the expansive lawn areas that inevitably happen, and largely because of budget reasons. Um, and so we also discussed permeable pavement, or at least just reducing hardscape, not allowing hardscapes or lawns to become really massive and expansive to interrupt water flowing across hardscapes through planting beds integrated into those hardscapes, and that where possible, using permeable paver systems, which are really hard in central North Carolina. It's so clayey here. It doesn't really necessarily perk down to the soil like the diagrams suggest, but that water can be collected in gravels beneath patios and hardscapes, and at least taken to rain gardens where it can be redistributed and held on to. So those were just some of the quick site design elements that we discussed yesterday in class. Um, um, uh, but I think really being involved with your local municipalities. Inevitably, they have committees that handle stormwater management, that handle environmental protection, and being present and helpful. Looking for nonprofit organizations like we have Keep Durham Beautiful and Trees Durham here, committed to creating and maintaining tree canopy in the city, which can reduce the heat island effect, which can at least help us reduce what sort of heat we're sending back into the atmosphere in an unnatural way because of all these unnatural hardscapes and lawns that are everywhere. And I find that frustrating the flow of stormwater, reducing the amount of heat we bounce back up into the atmosphere, reducing the amount of light that we bounce back up into the atmosphere, and also, I guess, kind of from a social perspective, pushing against the status quo and having gardens that are built off of a cottage gardening background like mine behind me, that maybe do have some wilder moments than other people behind me would just have lawn. I think the more that we normalize plantings that are a little bit more rambunctious than the status quo, or a little bit more diverse than the status quo, I think the more that we, I suppose, make people look at the plants around them. These gardens, like the one behind me and the ones proposed in the Wild Ones website, really shake the status quo. And I think they force people to not just be complacent as they look around the world around them, but to begin to recognize, to reduce plant blindness and to see the environment around them. And so I think we have a tremendous capacity to use particularly herbaceous plantings, but native plantings to help kind of shake things up, even just in a little way. And I think also once people recognize that your garden has a little bit of a mission behind it, I think that gets people excited. And so these are just all the ways that, I don't know, I think that we contribute to property by property, reducing our impact on the broader environment, and hopefully somehow reduce the impact of these giant storms, these more than 1,000-year storms that we've been experiencing lately.
It sounds like you're challenging your fellow Carolinians to really think about watershed health, watershed quality in their plantings and in their actions. And I know that's a space that our North Carolina chapters have been engaged in. In other areas of the country, for instance, the New York Metro region chapter, they have been focused on recovering, as you mentioned, the urban and suburban tree canopy that was devastated by Sandy over a decade ago. And so the chapters are, their activities and their initiatives are being informed by natural disasters, including my local Front Range chapter. We have our volunteers, our members mobilizing to collect native seeds, collect and share seeds from from members' native gardens, in part because local ecotype seeds are desperately needed for wildfire recovery and natural areas. And we want to be part of the solution, not add to the problem. So I recognize and applaud your efforts to inspire people to think more broadly about the impact that their landscapes have, and the impact that they can have through their local chapters. Wild Ones chapters are learning spaces where people come together to share knowledge and resources. Our chapters are also communication tools. They are platforms for members to amplify their voices, and megaphones through which members inspire and empower others to spark impactful change in their communities. What you plant in your garden matters. What you share with others matters more. Please consider the many ways that you can support your local Wild Ones chapter. I want to thank you, Preston, for sharing your insights and your experiences with us today. And thank you for your ongoing support of the North Carolina chapters. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I hope we will have the opportunity to continue the conversation.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to Wild Ones for this time. It was so much fun to represent the organization. And I believe in the work you're doing. And it's been an absolute joy to meet the various chapters. I'm excited that you guys are on this journey with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this Wild Ones Gardenside Chat. Be sure to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more native plant inspiration.